G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Footsteps of the Messiah. I pray that it will be a blessing to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session of the last days. We're in session 21. We're still in the Messianic kingdom. We finished off the last session looking at the type of government that we'll find in the kingdom. And we looked at the Gentile frame or form of government, and now we're going to look at the Jewish branch of government in the Messianic kingdom. In this, we're going to have, first up, we're going to look at David, who is both king and prince. Now, we covered in the last session the absolute monarchy of the Messiah, and his reign will extend to Israel as well as to the Gentile nations around the world. So he will sit above all. Now, the resurrected David, who is given the titles of both king and prince, will be directly under the Messianic king. So what David is going to do is King David will be the king over Israel. So he'll have authority over all Israel. He'll be a king because he will rule over Israel, but he'll be a prince in that he will function under the authority of the Messiah, who is king over the entire world. We can't have two kings over the entire world. So Messiah Jesus will be the king over the entire world. David will be king over Israel, but he'll also function as a prince under King Jesus. And just as all the Gentile nations will have kings, so too Israel will have their own king in David. Now, the big difference is that the Gentile kings will all have their natural bodies, while David will have his resurrected body. Remember, these Gentile kings are kings of the nations who come through the tribulation period and they come out the other side. Now, several passages speak of David as king over Israel and prince under King Messiah. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 9 speaks about this. Jeremiah says, "But they shall serve Jehovah their God and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them." So not only will the Jewish people in the future serve God, but they will also serve David their king. So in the future, when Israel is restored, it will no longer be a northern and a southern kingdom. It will no longer be Israel and Judah, but it's going to be one reunited nation under one ruler, and that will be the resurrected David. Now, according to Ezekiel 34, 23 to 24, "And I, Jehovah, will be their God, and my servant David, prince among them." So Jehovah, in the person of Messiah Jesus, will be their absolute king, while David serves under him as prince over Israel. Now, Ezekiel adds some more detail in Ezekiel 37, verses 24 to 25. In verse 24, he writes, "And my servant David shall be king over them, and they all shall have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my ordinances and observe my statutes and do them." In verse 25, "And David, my servant, shall be their prince forever." So David is going to be king, the King David that we know. David will be the prince and shepherd of the people, and under his guidance, Israel will be able to keep the righteous commandments of God. Now, Hosea, one of the minor prophets, Hosea chapter 3, verse 5 says that, "Afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek Jehovah their God and David their king, and shall come with fear unto Jehovah and to his goodness in the latter days." So Hosea states that in the future restoration, the Jewish people will not only be subservient to Jehovah their God, but also to David their king. So we see that David is called king, and he's also called prince as well. Now, these four passages that we've just looked at are often interpreted to mean David's greatest son, Messiah Jesus. And they the only way they can do that is that they interpret David symbolically, but nothing in the text that we read indicates that. In fact, the text simply states David. Now, if the prophets, if they wanted to refer to Messiah instead of David, they would have used terms like the root of Jesse or the branch of David or the son of David or the seed of David. But none of them used that. All of them did, they used the name David. So if we're looking at it from a literal interpretation, it's best to take the text as it reads, meaning the literal David, who in his resurrected form will function as the king over Israel and as a prince in subjection to the king of the entire world. Now, from the viewpoint of Israel, David will be their king ruling over them, but from the viewpoint of the Messiah, David will be a prince. So David will serve both as king and prince. Now, we also have the 12 apostles who will be serving as well, who will be ruling as well. Twice in the New Testament, Jesus promised the 12 apostles that they would rule over the 12 tribes in the kingdom. First of all, we see it in Matthew 19, verse 28, where Jesus says to them, "Verily I say unto you that you who have followed me, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his glory, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So when's it going to be? Well, the timing of this is at the regeneration or the renovation of the earth, when Jesus will be sitting upon the reestablished throne of David in his glory. Now, these 12 other thrones will be set up, one for each of the 12 tribes, and the apostles will sit on these thrones and exercise rule. Now, these are the 12 apostles, the ones who were with Jesus from his baptism until his ascension. The second passage is Luke 22, verse 28 to 30, where Jesus says to the apostles, "But you are they that have continued with me in my temptations, and I appoint unto you a kingdom, even as my Father appointed unto me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. And you shall sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So again, here Jesus extended the millennial kingdom that the Father appointed for him to the apostles. Now, while his rule will be over all the world and David's over all Israel, the apostles' jurisdiction will be over particular tribes. Each of them will be over one tribe. They're promised two privileges with this appointment. First of all, they'll be continually with Jesus and eating and drinking at his table throughout the entire kingdom, throughout the entire 1,000 years. Second, they have their own thrones from which they will rule over the tribes of Israel. Now, we also have another branch of Jewish government, and that's the princes. So we have the king, we have the apostles, or over the 12 tribes. Now we have princes. And several passages mention these guys, and they simply call them princes. One of them is Isaiah chapter 32, verse 1. "Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness," or that will be the Messiah, "and princes shall rule in justice." So the king reigning in righteousness will be Jesus the Lord. And we have the mention here of princes who will be in positions of authority. These princes are described as being just in character. They shall rule in justice, means they're just in character. Now, our second passage is Ezekiel 45, verse 8, excuse me, where it says, "And my princes shall no more oppress my people, but they shall give the land to the house of Israel according to their tribes." So here again, we have the mention of princes who are in positions of authority in the millennium. And these will not reign by oppressing their people, but in their authority will be the petitioning of the land of Israel into its 12 tribal divisions as part of the job that they have. Then we have a man called Zerubbabel. And this will be the resurrected Zerubbabel, which we found in Haggai chapter 2, verse 20 to 23. He is going to be most likely among these princes. So at some future time, God will shake the heaven. This is Haggai speaking here. At some future time, God will shake the heavens and the earth, which we see in verses 20 to 21. And he says, I will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them. So he's going to destroy the invading armies in verse 22. Both events will happen at the second coming. This is according to Haggai. Now, once these two events have occurred, Haggai 2, 20 and 21 and 22, once they've occurred, Zerubbabel is then given an exalted position. In verse 23, we see that in that day, says Jehovah of hosts, will I take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, says Jehovah, and I will make you as a signet, for I have chosen you, says Jehovah of hosts. So making him as a signet means that this will make him as close to God as a signet ring is to a king. So we'll see that Zerubbabel in this exalted position in the kingdom will apparently be among the princes mentioned by the other two prophets. And incidentally, Zerubbabel is also of the house of David. Now we see another group of leaders we have, or another branch of government. We have the judges and counselors. These guys are mentioned by Isaiah chapter 1, verse 26. So Isaiah says, and I will restore your judges as at the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. Afterward, you shall be called the city of righteousness, a faithful town. Now, these judges and counselors will be responsible for dispensing justice in a judicial sense, and there will be no perversion of this justice. Their position of authority will be particularly related to the city of Jerusalem. That's where their base of operations will be. And now the final branch of government is actually Israel. And this is the final link in the chain of command in the Jewish branch of government. And this is Israel as ruling over the head of the Gentiles. Now, God promised Israel, his people, in the book of Deuteronomy, that they would become the head of the Gentiles. In Deuteronomy 15, verse 6, for Jehovah your God will bless you as he promised you, and you shall lend unto many nations, but you shall not borrow. And you shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. Now, this has not happened as yet. This was part of Israel's reward for obedience, which we found in Deuteronomy 28, verse 1. In Deuteronomy 28, 1, it says, and it shall come to pass, if you shall hearken diligently unto the voice of Jehovah your God, to observe to do all his commandments, which I command you this day, that Jehovah your God will set you on high above all the nations of the earth. So this is going to happen at Israel's national regeneration. And Deuteronomy 28:13 goes on to say, and Jehovah will make you the head and not the tail, and you shall be above only, and you shall not be beneath. So again, this was dependent on their obedience, and we see this in the restoration and regeneration. Outside of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, the prophets also described Israel's future headship over the Gentiles, because we see Isaiah 14 verses 1 to 2, he prophesied that Gentiles will bring the Jews back to the land of Israel, and they'll be possessed by Israel. It's actually, they're going to become servants to Israel. And then Isaiah 49 verses 22 to 23 and Isaiah 61, 6 to 7 are also very similar passages. So there's a quick chart again, just to summarize the chain of governments. We have two branches, Gentile, Jewish branch. Gentile branch, we have the church and the tribulation saints. Then we have kings over the nations. Then we have the Gentile nations. In the Jewish branch, we have King David. Well, we have Messiah, the king over the entire world, and we have King David over Israel, 12 apostles over the 12 tribes. Then we have the princes, the judges and counselors who mainly work in Jerusalem. And then we have all Israel, which will be serving as the head of the Gentile nations. So the rod of iron that will characterize the rule of the government in the kingdom will be carried out through various spheres and positions of authority. Now, we're going to look at Israel in the Messianic kingdom, and we're going to look at four facets of the final restoration of Israel. Now, Israel within the period of the Messianic kingdom is a major theme of the Hebrew prophets. It was the high point of Old Testament prophecy, and every writing prophet, with the exception of Jonah, had something to say about it. That's a chart of Israel, what it's going to be like in the kingdom, with the various tribal allocations there, and where we have the temple down in Jerusalem. Four facets that we're going to be looking at, four primary facets to Israel's final restoration, and we're going to see that each of them are based upon a specific covenant. We're going to be looking at the regeneration of Israel, the regathering of Israel, the possession of the land, and the reestablishment of the Davidic throne. And we're going to survey each of these covenants as it relates to Israel's final restoration, along with the prophetic development of these covenants. Later on in this study, we'll look in more detail at these covenants, but for now, it's just a survey of them. Now, first up, with the regeneration of Israel, we look at the basis of it, and the basis of the regeneration is the new covenant. So we have the first facet of Israel's final restoration is the national regeneration of Israel, and the timing of this we covered in sessions before. This section here is concerned with the development of that motif. Now, the basis of Israel's final regeneration is the new covenant, and this is found in Jeremiah chapter 31, 31 to 34. Now, the announcement of the new covenant begins with a declaration that it will be a Jewish covenant, because Jeremiah states, God will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So this covenant is going to be in sharp contradistinction with the older Mosaic covenant, which verse 32 says, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers. The covenant that God made with their fathers was the Mosaic covenant, but this is going to be a new covenant. Now, of the 5 Jewish covenants, the Mosaic covenant was the only conditional covenant. Mosaic covenant, which meant that, if they did something, the condition, if they were obedient unto God, the condition was God would bless them. If they were disobedient unto God, God would curse them. Now, the Mosaic covenant was broken because Israel had not been faithful, even though God had been faithful in keeping his terms of the covenant. What did the Mosaic covenant do? Well, the Mosaic covenant showed the standard of righteousness which the Lord demanded, but it could not impart to the Jew the power to keep those laws. They lacked the power to keep them, the internal power, that is. Now, in verse 33 of Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah writes, I will put my law in their inward parts, and in their heart will I write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So in the new covenant, through regeneration, the necessary internal power will be provided to meet and to keep the righteous standards of God, because they're going to be indwelled by the Holy Spirit. And the result of this new covenant will be a total national regeneration of Israel. Verse 34 says, "For they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, says Jehovah, for I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin will I remember no more." So what will happen is that in the kingdom, every Jew from the least to the greatest will know the Lord. Everyone will be a believer. The sins of Israel will be forgiven and forgotten. Now, while there will be Gentile unbelievers in the kingdom, there will not be any Jewish unbelievers. Every Jew will believe in Messiah. There will be no need to tell a Jew to know the Lord, because they will all know him. So it's upon this new covenant that the first facet of Israel's restoration, the regeneration of Israel, is based. Now, the prophetic development. That Israel was to undergo a national regeneration is not confined to the words of the new covenant alone. Others, like the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 29:22-24, he states this: "Therefore, thus says Jehovah, who redeemed Abraham, concerning the house of Jacob, Jacob shall not now be ashamed, neither shall his face now wax old." Now, God made a promise to the patriarch Jacob. And even though for most of Jewish history, Jacob would have been ashamed of the waywardness of his descendants, when the national regeneration comes, he will have much to be proud of. Now, another passage is Isaiah 30, verses 18-22. And therefore, I'll read these verses. "And therefore will Jehovah wait, that he may be gracious unto you, and therefore will he be exalted, that he may have mercy upon you. For Jehovah is a God of justice. Blessed are all they that wait for him." Verse 20. "And though the Lord give you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, yet shall not your teachers be hidden any more, but your eyes shall see your teachers, and your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, when you turn to the right hand and when you turn to the left." So this passage here in Isaiah 30 tells us that the regeneration will be a result of the judgments of the Great Tribulation, which will be God's discipline upon the nation of Israel in order to correct it, or correct her. It will be by way of the judgments of the tribulation that Israel will come to a saving knowledge of her Messiah. Later on, again in Isaiah 44, verses 1-5, the prophet wrote, "It was God who chose Israel from the very beginning." Sorry, that's just a prelude. "It was God who chose Israel from the very beginning," which we see in verses 1-2. "O Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I have chosen. Thus says Jehovah that made you and formed you from the womb, who will help you. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, and you, Jeshurun, whom I have chosen." God will pour out his spirit upon the entire nation. He says in verse 3, "I will pour my spirit upon your seed and my blessing upon your offspring." So Israel will again bear fruit. They shall spring up among the grass as willows by the watercourses, and she will remain ever loyal to her God. One shall say, "I am Jehovah's," another shall call himself by the name of Jacob, and another shall subscribe with his hand unto Jehovah and surname himself by the name of Israel. So they will all be faithful to Jehovah God. Later on in chapter 44, verses 21 to 23, Isaiah now emphasized the removal of Israel's sins. I have formed you. You are my servant, O Israel. You shall not be forgotten of me. I have blotted out as a thick cloud your transgressions, and as a cloud your sins. Return unto me, for I have redeemed you. For Jehovah has redeemed Jacob and will glorify himself. Now, Israel's everlasting salvation and freedom from shame is seen now in Isaiah 45, verse 17. But Israel shall be saved by Jehovah with an everlasting salvation. You shall not be put to shame, nor confounded, world without end. Two other major prophets also spoke of this final regeneration, and that's Jeremiah 24, verse 7. And he writes that I will give them a heart to know me, that I am Jehovah, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. So this is part of the regeneration. So when God regenerates Israel, he will give them a heart to know him, and they'll be able to return to him with an undivided, regenerated heart. Now, at the time of Israel's regeneration, her sins will no longer be found, according to Jeremiah 50, verses 19 to 20. In those days, and in that time, says Jehovah, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought for, and there shall be none. And the sins of Judah, and they shall not be found. For I will pardon them whom I leave as a remnant. So what we see here is that Israel's sins will no longer be found, wiped away. Now, Ezekiel also spoke of that future regeneration of Israel in Ezekiel 11, verses 19 to 20. And I will give them one heart, and I'll put a new spirit within you. And he goes on to say, getting into verse 20, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances and do them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. So at regeneration, the Jewish people will be given a new heart and a new spirit, as their human spirit will be reborn, regenerated. And the result of this regenerating work will be an enablement to walk in and to keep his righteous standards. Later on in Ezekiel 36, verses 25 to 27, Ezekiel writes, and I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean from all your filthiness, and from all your idols will I cleanse you. So here he's saying that all of Israel's sins will be cleansed. And then in verse 26, he says, a new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. With this regenerate heart and spirit, Israel can now walk in newness of life. In verse 27, and I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my ordinances and do them. So the Holy Spirit will indwell the Jews, so they will now be empowered to walk in the commandments of the Lord. Hosea, who's one of the minor prophets, he also spoke quite a bit about God's punishment for Israel's sins and of her regeneration. We find this in Hosea chapter 1, verses 10 to chapter 2, verse 1. And we're not going to read them all, we're just going to highlight it here. Now, even though judgments will decimate the ranks of Israel, the time will come when the nation will actually increase tremendously in population. In first part of verse 10 of Hosea chapter 1, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. So also what we see is that for a very long period of time, the Jewish people were called Lo Ami. which means not my people. But now they will once again become Ami, which is my people. It says in the second part of verse 10 that they'll become sons of the living God. They'll become his people. The children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together. That's verse 11. That's where we see this reunification occurs, and the Jews will be God's people who have now obtained his mercy, which we see from verse 11 to chapter 2, verse 1. Now, not only does Hosea begin his book with Israel's regeneration, but he also ends with it in Hosea chapter 14, verses 4 to 8. He speaks about here that he said, God says, I will heal their backsliding. This is Israel's backslidings will be all thoroughly healed, for only then will she receive the manifold blessings of God. And in verse 6, speaking about her it says, his branches shall spread and his beauty shall be as the olive tree and his smell as Lebanon. They shall revive as the grain and blossom as the vine. So they're going to receive manifold blessings in this time. All idol worship will cease when the regeneration comes, because verse 8 says, Ephraim shall say, what have I to do any more with idols? So they'll have nothing else to do with idols. The nation, the land will be cleaned up. Now in Joel chapter 2, verses 28 to 32, we've done quite a bit about this in this study. This tells us that this regeneration of Israel will be a result of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. In Joel 2:28, and it shall come to pass afterward that I'll pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit. He goes on to say that he will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. This is all a tribulation period. The sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of Jehovah comes. So, verse 32 is what we're looking at. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of Jehovah shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those that escape, as Jehovah has said, and among the remnant those whom Jehovah does call. So, once the Holy Spirit is poured out on all Israel, then the people will call upon the name of the Lord. God will respond by delivering and saving them. And that's Joel. Now, the national regeneration of Israel will result in the total forgiveness of their sins, according to another minor prophet, Micah. Micah chapter 7, verses 18 to 20. Who is a God like unto you that pardons iniquity and passes over the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? Going on to verse 19. He will again have compassion upon us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot, and he will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. So what we see here is that God's loyal love for the chosen people, his people Israel, will cause him to pardon and to pass over the sins of Israel when he returns to them in all compassion. And then in verse 20, he will do so on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant, especially as it is developed in the salvation aspect of the new covenant. Remember, the Abrahamic covenant had the seed of all the other covenants in it. Now in verse 20, he says, you will perform the truth to Jacob and the loving kindness to Abraham, which you have sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. That's pertaining to the Abrahamic covenant there, Abraham and to Jacob. Another prophecy that speaks of Israel's regeneration is Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 9 to 13. For then will I turn to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of Jehovah to serve him with one consent. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, Even the daughter of my dispersed shall bring my offering. So throughout the dispersion, the Jews will begin to call upon the name of the Lord. No matter where they are, the Jewish people will respond so that regeneration will be complete and total. Now, one final passage here is the one in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 to 27. And this is Paul writing here about his brethren. Now, remember, Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, but he's writing here about his brethren, the Jews. For I would not, brethren, have you ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own conceits, that a hardening in part has befallen Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, even as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer. He shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away their sins. Now, Paul pointed out that the present blindness and hardening of Israel is not permanent. It is temporary, and it is temporary until the full number of Gentiles which have been preordained for the body of the Messiah is reached. That's what verse 25 tells us. It is then that the hardening of Israel will be removed, and all Jewish people living at that time will now be saved. And that's verses 26 to 27. Now we see in the regathering of Israel here, we see the restoration. Now we see the regathering of Israel. Now, the basis of the regathering is the land covenant, the land covenant. So we've done the new covenant, we've looked at the Abrahamic covenant, now the land covenant. Now, this is the second facet of the final restoration of Israel. And this is the regathering of the Jewish people from all over the world. And this is based on the land covenant of Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 1 to chapter 30, verse 20. Now, this covenant traditionally has been known as the Palestinian covenant because it concerned the land that for centuries was called Palestine. Palestine is Israel, but at the time it was a correct term. It was an appropriate term, and even the Jews used the name Palestine. However, today it's a little bit different. It's an unfortunate term for two reasons. First of all, it was a name given to the land by the Roman Emperor Hadrian after the second Jewish revolt under a guy called Simon Bar Kokhba, around about 132 to 135 AD. And he renamed it Palestine to try and erase any Jewish remembrance of Israel as part of his policy to de-Judaize the land. So he called it Palestine, which is very similar to the Philistine, to just take away any concept of it belonging to the Jews and to Israel. Now, second, that's the first purpose. Second thing is that due to the historical events in the Middle East in the 20th century, the name is more associated with Arabs than it is with Jews. And for these and other reasons, we're going to call the Palestinian covenant the land covenant. Now, the passage here begins with a clear statement that the land covenant is distinct and it is different from the Mosaic covenant. And we see this in 29 verse 1. The land covenant is eternal and unconditional, while the Mosaic covenant is both temporal and conditional. Deuteronomy then gives the historical summary of the wilderness wanderings leading up to the point of entering the promised land. And that goes from Deuteronomy 29, verse 2, right down to verse 9. But before this can occur, another covenant needs to be made in order to warn the Jewish people of things to come. And we find it in Deuteronomy 29, verses 10 to 13. Now, they are warned here against turning away from the Lord in 29 verses 14 to 21. And then they're told that they will do exactly that. They're going to turn away from the Lord. And that's going to result in the dispersion out of the land into the Gentile nations to endure a long period of persecutions. And we find it in Deuteronomy 29, verses 22 to 29. Now, this dispersion is not going to be permanent, because eventually there is going to be a regathering as described in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 10. It shall come to pass when all these things are come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you shall call them to mind among all the nations whither Jehovah your God has driven you, and shall return unto Jehovah your God, and shall obey his voice according to all that I command you this day, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul, that then Jehovah your God will turn your captivity and have compassion upon you, and will return and gather you from all the peoples where Jehovah your God has scattered you. If any of your outcasts be in the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will Jehovah your God gather you, and from thence will he fetch you. And Jehovah your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will do you good and multiply you above your fathers. Jehovah your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, to love Jehovah your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. So, after a long period of persecution, which was described in chapter 29, there'll be the regeneration of Israel as she returns to the Lord in verses 1 to 2. And then this is followed by the regathering of the Jewish people from all over the world, verse 3, so that even if they should be found in the uttermost parts of the heavens, they'll be returned. They'll be brought back into the promised land. But this regathering will occur only after the regeneration of Israel. And verse 7 to 10 goes on, Jehovah your God will put all these curses upon your enemies and on them that hate you, that persecuted you. You shall return and obey the voice of Jehovah and do all his commandments, which I command you this day. And Jehovah your God will make you plenteous in all the work of your hand, in the fruit of your body, and in the fruit of your cattle, and in the fruit of your ground, for good. For Jehovah will again rejoice over you for good, as he rejoiced over your fathers, if you shall obey the voice of Jehovah your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law, if you turn on to Jehovah your God with all your heart, with all your soul. So, at this time, the punishments previously applied to the nation of Israel will now be applied to the Gentiles, we see in verse 7. While curses may fall on the Gentiles, there will only be blessings for Israel in verses 8 to 9, because they will totally return to the Lord, verse 10. So the description of the land covenant ends with some further admonitions, warnings, and promises in verses 11 to 20 of chapter 30. Now, the prophetic development of this final regathering. The regathering that follows Israel, that follows the regeneration, is another high point of prophetic revelation to be found in many of the prophets. In Isaiah 11, verses 11 to 12, 6, it is described as the second of two worldwide regatherings of Israel. Verse 11 says, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. So the regathering described in this passage is the second one. This one is in faith, in preparation for the millennial blessings. Remember, the first worldwide regathering was in unbelief, in preparation for judgment. This one, the second one, is a regathering in faith, in preparation for the blessings of the millennial kingdom. This regathering is not simply a local gathering from the nations of the Middle East, but this one is from all over the world. It says from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And it goes on to say, he will set up an ensign for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gathered together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So this is a worldwide regathering. Isaiah then goes on to develop certain characteristics of Israel's final regathering, making two observations. First up, we have the unity between Israel and Judah will be restored. And that's in verses 13 to 14. If Ephraim's envy of Judah will cease, that was an envy that developed over the placing of the house of God in Judah, in Jerusalem. And you can see that in Psalm 78, verses 9 to 11, and Psalm 78, verses 67 to 18. This unity will now enable the Jewish people to overcome their opponents. It says, they shall fly down the shoulder of the Philistines in the west, together they shall despoil the children of the east. So they'll be able to overcome their enemies, their opponents. Second, the final regathering will be accompanied by miracles in verses 15 to 16. We see the tongue of the Egyptian sea, that's the Gulf of Suez, that's going to dry up, while the Euphrates will be smitten and divided into 7 smaller streams so as to make it easy to cross. As a highway was made for Israel at the Exodus, there will likewise be one again in the final regathering. This is the final regathering in belief, remember. Now, immediately after the Exodus, Israel sang the song found in Exodus 15, verses 1 to 18. Now, in the same way, after the final regathering, Israel will sing the song found in Isaiah 12, 1 to 6. This song has 2 stanzas. The first stanza, it goes, and in that day, this is 12, verse 1, and in that day you shall say, I will give thanks unto you, O Jehovah. For though you were angry with me, your anger is turned away, and you comfort me. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For Jehovah, even Jehovah, is my strength and song, and he's become my salvation. Therefore, with joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation. So here we see in the first stanza, in verses 1 to 3, Israel gives thanks to God for turning away anger. That's verse 1. The Jews now realize that salvation is in God alone. Verse 2, who has now poured out the waters of salvation freely in verse 3. Now, second stanzas in verses 4 to 6. And in that day shall you say, give thanks unto Jehovah, call upon his name, declare his doings among the peoples, make mention that his name is exalted. Sing unto Jehovah, for he has done excellent things. Let this be known in all the earth. Cry aloud and shout, you inhabitant of Zion, for great in the midst of you is the Holy One of Israel. So here in this second stanza, they wish to make known God's deeds to all the world, so they give thanks again, verse 4. And they sing in verse 5, and shout out loud of God's goodness in verse 6. Later on, in Isaiah 27, verses 12 to 13, the prophet writes this: it shall come to pass in that day that Jehovah will beat off his fruit from the flood of the river unto the brook of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, O ye children of Israel. And it shall come to pass in that day that a great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come that were ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and they that were outcast in the land of Egypt. And they shall worship Jehovah in the holy mountain of Jerusalem. Here, the emphasis in this passage is on the totality of the regathering. For every Jew, one by one, would be brought back into the land of Israel. Now, as in the previous Isaiah passage, the region mentioned is the Middle East. The Jewish people will be regathered from other nations in the Middle East, since as a result of the fall of Israel in the middle of the tribulation, most of them will be located in this vicinity, because that's where they fled. It was easy to flee in this area. And it is here that they will have suffered the most. And so the Jews are going to be taken one by one out of Egypt and Assyria, modern day Iraq, And Jews are still to be found in various Arab countries suffering tremendous persecutions. But in the regathering, they will be rescued from the land of their enemies. So while the regathering will be from all over the world, a special emphasis is placed on the nations of the Middle East. The magnitude of the final regathering of Israel we find in Isaiah 43 verses 5 to 7. Now, as far as locality is concerned, the regathering is going to be worldwide. And to emphasize the fact, all 4 points of the compass are mentioned. It's from the east, and gather you from the west. I'll say to the north, give up, and to the south, keep not back. So it's from every part of the earth. Now, the magnitude of the event is illustrated by the usage of 3 words in verses 5 to 7 here. It's created, formed, and made. Verse 7 says, everyone that is called by my name and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, yes, whom I have made. Now, these 3 words, created, formed, and made, these 3 words were actually used interchangeably in the creation account of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So from God's perspective, the final regathering will be on the magnitude of the original creation. Now, we'll knock this off. The prophet Jeremiah also mentioned the comparative magnitude of the final regathering with previous works of God. In Jeremiah 16, verses 14 to 15, he likened it to the Exodus. And for millennia, the Exodus has been considered the high point of Jewish history, as Jehovah lives that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Passover, we celebrate the freedom from Egypt, the Exodus coming out. But this will change. In the future, it will be the final regathering of Israel that will become the pinnacle of Jewish history. Later on in Jeremiah 23, 3 to 4, the prophet stated, I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries whither I have driven them, and will bring them again to their folds, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. And I will set up shepherds over them, who shall feed them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be lacking, says Jehovah. So what we see here is that from all over the world, the Jews are to be regathered into the land where they will produce much fruit. God will provide virtuous leaders who will feed the people with righteousness, justice, and understanding. This ends our session. Study hard, grow strong, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for coming along.